Elena Shaw clocked in at 05:12 every morning, 28 minutes before the first shift whistle echoed across Reading Air Force Base. Her coveralls were always the same faded gray-green, sleeves rolled just enough to keep the cuffs out of the turbine bay, never high enough to show skin. She moved with the practiced rhythm of someone who didn't just work around aircraft. She respected them. She stood about 5'5", hair pulled into a low, practical ponytail with no frills or pins. Her hands were always stained, thick with dark grease that clung beneath her nails and into the creases of her knuckles. Younger airmen joked she used motor oil as lotion. They called her Grease Girl like it was a joke she hadn't already heard 1,000 times. Sometimes they laughed as she climbed into intake ducts with a torque wrench. One leaned against a tow tractor last week and said loud enough for her to hear that she probably moonlighted fixing microwaves at the mess hall. Another bet she didn't know the difference between a stabilizer, actuator, and a vending machine. Elena didn't respond. She just wiped a thin film of hydraulic fluid off a panel edge with the back of her glove and kept working. Nobody could ever remember her raising her voice. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did talk, her words were short, clipped, and technical. Maintenance logs were always accurate. Tool drawers were always sorted. She never forgot a torque spec. If you asked for help, she gave it. If you watched her hands while she worked, you'd see that she knew every bolt by feel. The funny thing was, none of the new guys had ever actually seen her mess anything up. Systems she signed off on passed inspection the first time, every time. Engines she cleared ran smoother than the test sheets predicted, yet they still kept the jokes going. Grease Girl. The base's walking punchline. No one ever asked how long she'd been there. No one cared that her badge read Senior Technician. That morning, she'd spent 40 minutes diagnosing a flicker in the forward avionics bay of an A-18F that even the lead engineer hadn't noticed. She didn't log it. She just fixed it. When a gust of wind caught her sleeve as she climbed down the ladder, no one was looking yet. The skin just above her elbow flashed for a moment. Silver ink. Sharp lines. A shape someone might have seen once. But no one paid attention. Not yet. The wind picked up again at 06:48, pulling at the loose sleeve of Elena's coveralls as she reached overhead to secure a diagnostic port cover. This time, one of the younger maintenance crew happened to glance up. His smirk faltered, just above her left elbow, etched into her skin in fine, metallic lines. Was an hourglass clutched by silver wings. Not ink black, not green, silver. It shimmered briefly before the fabric dropped back down. He said nothing, just looked away. 15 yards across the tarmac. Colonel Thomas Keller paused mid-step. He hadn't been watching her directly, just passing through on a routine perimeter check. But his peripheral vision caught that flash of reflective ink. The color, the shape. He stopped cold. For a moment, his boot hovered above the concrete before it dropped flat with a sharp sound. The coffee in his left hand began to tilt before slipping from his fingers entirely, shattering across the ramp in a burst of ceramic and brown liquid. He turned without a word and walked back toward the command building. Inside the secure operations center, Keller moved with urgency but not panic. He tapped his badge twice to gain access to the biometric console, input a second code, and selected Level 6 Tag Search. The touchscreen prompted for keywords. He typed silver-winged hourglass. The system paused. Then something he hadn't seen in over a decade flashed across the screen. Match found. Subject code. Ghost tier. RA9 clearance level. X red band access only status Kaya. Confirmed. 12 AUG 2008. Polaris incident. Keller stared at the screen. He blinked once, then reached for the encrypted terminal behind him. His fingers hovered over the call list before he keyed in an internal command line. No one else needed to know yet. Not until he was sure. RA9 had been buried. Not just off the books, but locked behind 3 physical keys and a dead man's file rotation. It wasn't supposed to show up anywhere, and yet here it was. a record so sensitive that even confirming it triggered a red alert log in the central defense cloud. He replayed what he saw on the tarmac. Small frame, ponytail, coveralls stained from years of work, calloused hands, not a trace of rank or decoration. She didn't match the profile of anyone capable of surviving Polaris, let alone disappearing from the system. Yet, that tattoo wasn't decorative. It was assigned. A unit insignia issued only to 7 known operatives cleared for neural combat systems. Keller sat in the dim glow of the screen and looked again at the confirmation. Elena Shaw, Senior Maintenance Technician, Hangar 12, Clearance Standard, active since 2013, prior history, none, except that now he knew there had been something before. Something deliberately erased. He tapped the biometric scanner a second time and pulled up the ghost file list. There were only 7 names. Only one was still marked active location unknown. Her field name had been Tier Echo, Technical Interface Emergency Recovery. She wasn't just a specialist. She had been the last person authorized to design override procedures for unmanned stealth architecture. He leaned back slowly. The base was quiet outside, a soft rumble of turbine startup somewhere to the east. But inside his chest, something cold began to settle. He had just seen a ghost, one no one was supposed to find. And she was tightening bolts on a fighter jet like she'd never been anywhere near war. RA-9 wasn't created for war. It was created for silence. Officially, the unit didn't exist outside of 3 hard copy authorization packets and a deep-layered entry in the Department of Defense Special Projects Archive. It was never part of a standard command chain. It reported directly to Joint Special Operations Command, under a name no one used out loud. Its mission profile was built around neural interface combat platforms, quantum-secure battlefield data exfiltration, and hostile system intrusion. Where conventional teams used drones, RA-9 used human-machine hybrid interfaces that let operators command aerial and ground assets as if they were extensions of their own limbs. Their tools weren't rifles or grenades. They used microbursts of code, infrared spectrum scramblers, and real-time adaptation software to pull classified data straight from enemy mainframes. They didn't jam signals. They rewrote them mid-transmission. Most of their operations took place in denied airspace using aircraft without tail numbers. One prototype, the Ghost Raven, was a delta-wing autonomous airframe with a narrow RCS profile and no heat plume. Only RA-9 had access to its interface deck. It was flown not with a stick and throttle, but through what was known as T-loop integration. No screens, no keyboards, just a skin-level neural band that translated thought into maneuver. Elena Shaw was the senior integration engineer assigned to develop T-loop from ground-up firmware. She never flew the missions herself, but she built the language they used to navigate the edge of human-machine convergence. She led the team that designed emergency override branches for real-time system collapse. Her role wasn't tactical. It was foundational. She understood failure at the code level before it happened in the field. In August 2008, RA-9 was deployed on a data recovery operation near the Arctic Circle. Their target was Polaris Field, a deep freeze research station with an embedded server vault once used by a NATO intelligence black cell. The vault held raw access logs tied to third-party contractors who had built next-generation targeting software. RA-9's job was to extract and vanish. Something went wrong during atmospheric calibration. An experimental signal loop designed for cloaked communication created a feedback cascade. It breached all 5 control layers, corrupted auxiliary power failsafes, and detonated half the station's hardware stack. 31 personnel were killed instantly. 3 UAVs burned in their hangars. The fire suppression system failed under the load. The Department of Defense classified the incident as catastrophic signal overflow. All remaining RA-9 members were declared KIA. The program was locked and compartmentalized under Level X jurisdiction. No recovery attempts were recorded. No survivors listed. But Elena had never been on site during the explosion. Her role that month was firmware stabilization from a remote development hub in Nevada. Her name was redacted from the archive shortly after the incident. Her credentials voided. No transfer orders were filed. No reassignment followed. She vanished from the system at 1417 on August 12th. RA-9 became a story passed between intelligence analysts late at night, a whisper about a unit that flew aircraft without cockpits, a cautionary tale of tech pushing too far, too fast. But for those who worked alongside them, RA-9 wasn't myth. It was a memory soaked in static, marked by silence, and sealed with names no one dared to repeat. And Elena Shaw had once been the voice behind their machines. Colonel Keller had read enough redacted files to know the difference between a disaster and a cover-up. Polaris Field was labeled a technological failure, but as he scrolled through internal memos, buried in footnotes and risk reports, a different picture formed. RA-9 hadn't been shut down because it failed. It had been erased because it succeeded. The technology they used was 20 years ahead of its time. Fully integrated control of air and ground platforms, seamless command relays that bypassed chain-of-command latency. Their missions finished before senior brass even saw the problem. Operators who didn't wait for green lights, systems that didn't need permission. They made war efficient. And that terrified people with stars on their collars. Elena Shaw wasn't the most decorated in the unit, but her code made it all possible. She designed the neural sync layers that let RA-9 run without direct oversight. The aircraft responded to thought. Protocol updates deployed in real time. She built back doors that no one else could find, not even the program she wrote them into. Not as sabotage, as safety. But it also meant she could bypass every failsafe in the command stack. The few who knew what she could do started asking dangerous questions. What if the system disobeyed? What if a single person held control of a platform worth more than any fighter wing in the Air Force? What if someone like her disappeared? In the wrong hands. Battlefield integration could collapse a defense network in less than a minute. So they made her vanish before she chose to walk away. The decision came fast. No trial. No closed-door hearing. Just a memo with 3 signatures and a black cover sheet. The team was scattered. Some reassigned to foreign attaché units. Others sent stateside with new names and burned credentials. No one was told the full story. Only that RA-9 was no longer viable, and that its ghost code would never be used again. Keller read the internal commentary on Elena's final assessments. Words like independent actor and unstable control autonomy appeared in margins, not because she had failed, because she operated too cleanly, too fast, without layers of authorization slowing her down. She saw systems like living things, and that made her a liability to people who believed control was more important than results. He looked up from the screen. For 10 years, she'd worked unnoticed in a hangar most people forgot existed, fixed landing gear brackets, rewired sensor relays, ran diagnostics on legacy birds headed to storage. But now, Keller knew the truth. She hadn't hidden because she feared punishment. She'd chosen silence over control, buried herself in routine to keep anyone from ever asking her to use that power again. RA-9 didn't die in the cold. It was buried in bureaucracy because it worked too well. And Elena Shaw, the last living thread to that system, had kept her head down not out of shame, but to protect the world from what she still knew. At Aero 213 on a Tuesday morning, a radar technician logged a full failure in the long-range targeting system of an aging F-16C. The diagnostic flagged a corrupted data loop between the AESA array and the onboard control module. Senior avionics personnel scheduled it for full disassembly by week's end. Estimated repair time was 4 days minimum. Parts had to be flown in from Hill Air Force Base. By 0607, the system passed self-check with 0 errors. Nobody submitted a repair ticket. No part numbers were logged. The tech who flagged the issue swore he hadn't touched it since tagging it offline. But when they opened the panel, they found 3 lines of diagnostic code rewritten by hand, with a makeshift patch across the bus connector that hadn't come from standard inventory. Someone had rigged the bypass using parts stripped from a retired ground radar unit. And whoever did it had also shielded the connector head with conductive cloth to block RF bleed. That wasn't standard practice. That was something else entirely. A week later, a C-130J came in for emergency inspection after a hydraulic issue locked its nose gear mid-taxi. The maintenance chief ordered the aircraft parked and grounded pending structural analysis. Nobody could figure out how it had cleared pre-flight. An entire engineering team spent 2 days examining the pressure transducer array and still came up blank. Then at 04:42 on the third night, someone noticed the gear system had fully reset. No service call, no shift report. But the fuse box showed signs of recent work. A solder line had been reflowed. The relay mount had been reseated with surgical precision, right down to the torque value on the casing bolts. Only one person on base had access to the airframe and that level of finesse with a manual iron. Her name was on the shift board that night, Elena Shaw. At first, nobody said anything. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe she just prepped the bay. But then a pattern started forming. Issues marked unresolvable kept vanishing by the next morning. Low-band antenna ghosting on a T-38. Gone. Cooling loop glitch in a stealth intake on a drone prototype. Stabilized. Flight computer on a decommissioned MQ-1 that shouldn't have booted at all came online long enough to pull archived telemetry that had been considered lost. Each time, the fix came overnight, always with non-standard components, always using methods no one could trace in the manuals. Every system repaired showed signs of performance that exceeded baseline specs. By then, even the most skeptical engineers had stopped laughing at the grease under her fingernails. They started watching her work more closely, not openly, just in passing. They noticed how she listened to the airframe, how she paused before touching a panel, like she was waiting for it to tell her where it hurt, how she didn't use notes, didn't carry a tablet, just a flashlight, a multimeter, and a memory that somehow recalled where every subsystem used to live, even the ones replaced years ago. Colonel Keller reviewed 10 years' worth of maintenance archives. None of her fixes were filed, no signatures, no credit, but across that decade, one line kept surfacing. System returned to spec after night cycle. No explanation. Now there was one. Elena didn't just fix what was broken. She made machines remember what they used to be. And nobody understood how, except maybe her. She didn't ask for thanks. She didn't explain. But every time she picked up a wrench, the entire base ran smoother, quietly, as if something long buried had begun to wake up again. At 0804, the test flight of aircraft 71X, a modified A-18F Super Hornet equipped with the new Spectral Stealth nav system, cleared the airspace east of Reading Air Force Base. Weather was calm. Visibility extended beyond 30 miles. The pilot, a veteran with over 2,000 hours in type, reported nominal conditions through initial climb and banking maneuvers. At 0809, he radioed a deviation. Magnetic drift was pulling the aircraft off course. Despite stable input, INS alignment had gone erratic. The digital HUD began to flicker, and flight control inputs started lagging by almost a full second. By 0811, he had lost stability. Authority on the yaw axis. The Super Hornet entered a slow rightward roll. Autopilot disengaged without command. Inside the control tower, the test flight controller called for immediate diagnostic overlay. The display lit up red. Primary flight computer was rejecting manual corrections, interpreting all inputs as hostile overrides. Communications dropped for 2 full seconds. Then came the pilot's voice. Lower now. Almost urgent. He couldn't keep the nose level. At 0812, the aircraft dipped below 1,500 feet. Descent rate doubled within seconds. The last visual from ground tracking showed its silhouette corkscrewing gently toward the northwest boundary of the base, right in the direction of the PT field. That field was active. Over 100 personnel recruits, admin staff, and support were running laps, stretching in formation, or mid-drill. They had no visual or audio warning. The airframe was operating in near-silent test mode. No external alarms, no crash, klaxon, just the distant whine of a jet engine losing control overhead. In the tower, voices overlapped. One officer shouted to reroute ATS. Another called out velocity decay. An engineer tried to rerun the nav software through a remote override, but the system rejected every command line. Even the emergency ladder protocol failed. No one had trained for a total interface lockout on a hybrid control system that hadn't passed operational review. Someone said they were about to lose a $75 million test platform, but the aircraft was already below 900 feet. In the adjacent hangar bay, Colonel Keller had just exited a security briefing when the first alert hit his phone. He didn't need details. He heard the clipped language over the comms: stability loss, pitch control unresponsive, terrain risk escalating. At Euro 813, the left engine coughed once. A plume of black smoke drifted from the fuselage. The flight telemetry screen flashed vertical drop markers in red. No ejection, no signal of recovery. And no one on base had a method left to stop what was coming. Keller stood at the far end of the control floor, watching the screen track the descent in real time. The aircraft wasn't headed for an empty field. It was about to come down on a section of base that couldn't evacuate fast enough. Two officers leaned into their consoles, typing faster than their hands could keep up. One keyed a manual radio burst. Another flipped through the hardbound emergency flight override manual, hoping for a forgotten clause. But this wasn't a standard system. This was experimental, unwritten, built for speed and stealth, not for recovery. At Euro 814, someone muttered the word nobody wanted to say: impact. And in that frozen second, everything went quiet. The silence inside the control tower cracked when Elena stepped through the side entrance at 0814. She didn't rush. She didn't speak right away. She glanced at the telemetry screen, then at the red indicator flashing over the aircraft's last known altitude. It was falling faster than the override relay could respond. "I need access to the system," she said. A junior officer turned from his station and looked at her like she'd lost her mind. He told her she didn't have clearance, that this was a restricted platform, classified tech. His voice rose a little too sharp, maybe to mask the fear creeping into it. Colonel Keller cut him off. "She built it." The room froze again. Keller didn't look at her. He looked at the tech. "She designed the original logic layer. She's the only one here who can talk to it." The officer hesitated, then stepped aside. Elena didn't waste time. She moved to the auxiliary command console, sat down, and began typing. Not like she was thinking, like she was remembering. Her fingers moved in tight patterns, bypassing menu screens entirely. She entered a manual override code from memory, one that hadn't existed in a training syllabus for over a decade. The screen flashed once, then the main display blinked. A new message appeared across the top line in white, centered, all caps. "Welcome back. Raw 9 Ghost here." Nobody spoke. A few in the room stepped closer without realizing they had. The pilot's vitals returned. His voice cut in over the radio, ragged but still in control. Elena didn't react. Her eyes stayed on the screen. She entered a series of commands that rewrote the input tree in real time, overriding the active nav stack with legacy fallback logic. She bypassed the corrupted spectral layer entirely and shifted the aircraft to manual vector recontrol using rotational redundancy no longer listed in the platform's official specs. At 0815, the descent rate slowed. She leaned forward, issued one final input, and said, more to herself than anyone else, "Stability window locked." The air in the tower didn't move. All anyone could hear was the breathing of a room full of people who had just watched a woman they barely noticed yesterday take control of the most advanced aircraft in development by memory. And no one asked who she really was. Not anymore. At Aero 815, Elena executed the first hard redirect. The control algorithm she'd input wasn't listed in any current documentation. It belonged to a buried fork of RA9 flight protocols, designed for neural override during partial system loss. She typed like someone who had lived inside the aircraft itself. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's voice steadied. Flight surfaces were responding again. Barely, but enough. The roll axis had stabilized. Altitude drop slowed to under 300 feet per minute. The left engine was still venting dark smoke, but the structure held. Crosswind gusts were building out of the northwest. The tower flagged conditions at 19 knots, gusting over 26, too unstable for autoland. But Elena had already made the call. She rerouted vector mapping to a secondary legacy logic thread, one the aircraft didn't officially support anymore. The pilot followed her voice. She gave coordinates like she knew the wind would shift half a second before it did. Her tone never rose, never rushed. She used call signs that hadn't been spoken aloud on that base in nearly 15 years. At airweight 17, she ordered a gear drop override. It was risky. If the hydraulic lines hadn't fully reset, the gear wouldn't lock. But when the landing camera flicked online, the wheels held, locked. Manual pressure check confirmed. The bird was coming down whether it wanted to or not. The field had cleared. Barely. Ground personnel were still sprinting for cover at the edges of the running track. 2 security trucks had blocked off the outer perimeter in case of overshoot. Every eye on the base turned skyward. Elena brought the aircraft into its final turn at 0818. Crosswinds pushed hard from the left. The pilot corrected late, but Elena compensated early through the logic backend, tricking the system into recalculating pitch trim before the control input fully landed. She watched the glide path compress. She didn't blink. Touchdown hit at airweight 1906. The left wheel made contact first. The nose dipped forward. Then the main gear held. Reverse thrust activated late, but drag chutes deployed on her backup command. The aircraft skidded 15 yards past the safe line, nose cone steaming, both engines idling unevenly. But it stopped. For 5 full seconds, nobody spoke. Then the tower erupted, not in shouts or cheers, just movement, staggered breaths. One officer collapsed into his chair, hand over his mouth. Colonel Keller watched through the window, one hand resting on the rail. Outside, ground teams rushed the airframe. Fire crews approached with caution, then pulled back as the pilot stepped out, uninjured, helmet in hand, face pale but intact. He looked at the tower, then turned toward the hangar. That's when the first soldier spoke. He wasn't senior. A maintenance airman. Early 20s, maybe. One of the ones who used to call her Grease Girl when she passed in the motor pool. He stood by the chain-link fence near the taxiway and raised his hand. Not high, just enough. He saluted her. Not because someone ordered it. Not out of fear. Just because in that moment, everyone knew who had landed that plane. Elena stood behind the glass, still watching the screen. She didn't smile. She didn't move. Her hands stayed resting on the edge of the console like she hadn't quite returned yet. But everyone else had, and they would never look at her the same way again. Elena didn't speak at the after-action review. She sat near the rear wall, hands folded, listening as others debriefed what they could barely explain. She declined the public commendation at 09:30 the next morning. The base commander offered a framed citation. She said no. Not out of pride, just preference. By the end of the week, interviews were requested from 3 news outlets. Requests were denied. No footage was released. Colonel Keller had already signed the classification order. The only visible reminder was a line of white chalk still faintly visible on the tarmac. On Monday, a new sign appeared outside the East Maintenance Room. The letters were stenciled clean into the metal. It read, "Authorized for ghost tier only." No one claimed responsibility. No one removed it. The sign stayed. The hangar grew quieter after that. The ones who used to talk loud when she walked by, they lowered their voices now. Not from shame, just awareness. Some began nodding as she passed, others standing slightly straighter. One of the junior airmen who used to laugh behind her back asked if she'd show him the right torque, offset, on a hydraulic pump. She said yes. By the second week, a systems engineer asked her to look over a diagnostic patch before submission, not because she had rank, but because her eyes found patterns theirs didn't. She never corrected them when they called her chief. Technically, she wasn't. Her pay grade didn't change. She still parked behind the maintenance shed, still carried the same scratched toolbox with the faded tape on the handle, but the atmosphere had shifted. No formal brief ever acknowledged what she'd done. The landing report read, "Emergency reversion to legacy stabilization code under local protocol." But the name behind that code still classified, only Keller, and maybe a few old analysts from a long-buried command tier knew the whole picture. The rest only saw her presence, the way she moved, the calm, the depth behind her quiet. Soldiers picked up their tools with more care around her now. Even the techs with 15 years of avionics work would glance her way before adjusting anything on the ghost-tier platforms. At 17:10 on a Thursday, she exited the bay carrying a sealed data pack. A younger mechanic passed her in the corridor and stopped. He didn't salute. He just said, "Evenin', ma'am." Simple. No irony. No joke. She nodded once. That was enough. She kept walking. No medal was pinned to her chest. No headline ran her name. But on that base, something had shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't announced. But it was real. And Elena Shaw went back to work. Same coveralls. Same hands stained with grease. Same quiet presence that once went ignored. Except now, every wrench turned just a little more carefully. Every circuit traced twice before final lockout. Every engineer paused a half-second longer when crossing her path. And without a single word, the culture had changed. Colonel Keller didn't write much in his logbook anymore. Just bullet points, mission dates, maintenance summaries. But this time, he stayed late in his office, the lights dim, and the base quiet beyond the windows. 21:45. He started the entry with that, then sat still. There was no field for what he needed to say, no regulation form for what Elena had done. He stared at the ink for a long moment before putting the pen down and just thinking. Over 30 years in uniform, he'd seen awards handed out like candy, and others never given at all. He'd seen men with chestfuls of ribbons who couldn't keep their voice steady when systems crashed. And he'd seen others quiet ones, forgotten ones step in when everything else broke. He thought back to the look on her face that day. Not pride, not even urgency. Just focus. Like her hands knew where to go before her mind even caught up. She hadn't hesitated. No protocol existed for what she did. That aircraft should have crashed. The data logs confirmed total avionics loss. The autopilot was fighting itself. The angle of attack was unrecoverable by any standard input. But somehow, Elena rewrote the outcome. Not by heroics, not by shouting orders, but by knowing something no one else did, and doing it without asking for anything back. Keller rubbed his eyes. It wasn't fear that made leadership slow to act. It was structure. Everyone followed someone, but she didn't. Not because she thought she was above it, because she'd already lived through something worse, and survived it. She could have stayed hidden forever, but when the moment came, she stepped forward. Not for credit, not for redemption, just because it had to be done. The most dangerous person on any base isn't the loudest. It's not the one with the highest clearance or the best record. It's the one who doesn't flinch when everything fails. The one who knows where the override lives, even when no one else remembers the system exists. At 22:08, he wrote her name down, then crossed it out. The log was still classified. Her status, technically, was inactive. But legends don't need records. The next morning, she was already at work by 06:00. Same boots, same coveralls, same silence. She passed Keller once in the hall. He paused. She gave him the smallest nod. He didn't return it. Not out of disrespect. He just didn't want to draw attention. Some stories don't start with trumpets. And some heroes don't wear rank. They wear grease and time and silence.